Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. And as always, it's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Let's go ahead and start off with a review of the most important stories coming straight out of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have withdrawn from the strategic town of Vuhledar in the Donetsk Oblast. The withdrawal comes amid intensified Russian efforts to encircle the town and strain Ukrainian defenses. It has taken over 2.5 years and cost over an estimated 10,000 Russian lives and over $1 billion.
According to the Ukrainian military, the decision was made in an effort to preserve the remaining personnel. Ukrainian troops had defended Vuhledar for nearly 2 years, fending off repeated Russian attempts to capture the town since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. Russian forces have made renewed efforts to encircle Vuhledar, sending in reserves to attack from the flanks, which strained Ukrainian defenses. Local authorities confirmed that Russian troops entered the town on October 1st, while heavy fighting in the area continues. Vuhledar, located about 50 kilometers southwest of occupied Donetsk, is a key logistical hub for Ukrainian troops. It's positioned on the intersection of several roads, making it crucial for controlling supply routes in the region. Military analysts have noted the town's strategic importance, particularly as it is the last major fortified position ahead of the village of Velika Novosilka and other Ukrainian-controlled areas in southern Donetsk region.
Ukraine has significantly expanded its domestic ammunition production and successfully tested a homegrown ballistic missile, according to President Volodymyr Zelensky, who spoke at Ukraine's International Defense Industry Forum. The event, held in Kyiv, gathered nearly 300 weapons manufacturers from over 30 countries.
Zelensky highlighted a dramatic increase in Ukraine's defense production, noting that artillery and mortar ammunition output has increased by 25 times last year. Ukraine is now capable of producing 4 million drones annually and manufactures more than 15 howitzers per month. The president also discussed the development of long-range weapons, with drone and ballistic missiles having recently passed flight tests. These weapons are crucial for Ukraine's defense strategy, as its Western partners have so far been refusing to authorize deep strikes into Russia with foreign-made weapons. Despite U.S. restrictions on long-range strikes, Ukraine has successfully targeted Russian military infrastructure using domestically produced drones.
Around 1.5 million Ukrainian children in Russian-occupied territories are at high risk of deportation to Russia. The Kremlin has been involved in illegal deportations of children since the war in Ukraine began in 2014. The International Criminal Court has already indicted President Vladimir Putin for his role in the heinous war crimes.
Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has abducted over 20,000 children, fewer than 400 of whom have since returned home, according to the Children of War database. The deported children's personal information is often altered, making it difficult for their families to locate them. Some returned children have also reported harsh punishment and verbal abuse at the hands of their captors. Many were sent to re-education camps, where they were subjected to Russian propaganda and forced to deny their Ukrainian heritage. Some children, particularly from orphanages in the Kherson region, have been illegally adopted by Russian families. The International Criminal Court, or the ICC, has issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for his role in the illegal deportations, which violate the Fourth Geneva Convention and constitute a war crime under international law.
Speaking at the Warsaw Security Forum, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges warned that NATO lacks key defense systems and readiness for a large-scale conventional war, particularly against Russia. Concerns about a potential conflict between Russia and NATO have grown ever since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Hodges emphasized Western armies' shortcomings in the areas of air defense, military mobility, and ammunition supply. He also noted that NATO's eastern flank has just 5% of the air defense capabilities needed to deter potential attacks, which could leave critical infrastructure vulnerable. Europe's transport infrastructure is also at risk, with a hypothetical Russian strike likely to severely delay reinforcements. The retired general also pointed to the slow mobilization of NATO forces, contrasting today's state of readiness with the Cold War era, when troops could deploy within 24 hours. Hodges added that investments in ammunition production and military exercises are crucial, praising Poland's planned military upgrades.
And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. And for that, I'm now joined by American journalist based in Ukraine and good friend of us here on Ukraine This Week, Zarina Zabrysky.
Hi, Don. It's good to see you.
It's great to have you on again, Zarina. Now, I'd like you, for our viewers, of course, to highlight what it is you're doing there. You've been doing a fantastic job there in Kherson in the Sumy region. And it seems like the situation that Russian forces continue to hunt civilians with FPV drones is still relentless. Tell us about the latest from those front lines.
Yes, Don, actually, I believe that we are now talking about the future of the warfare. In fact, if you hear strange sound during our talk, this would be my personal analyzer device, which hears the approaching drones and makes sounds to warn me. Not that I can do much, but at the moment I have about 5 drones in the vicinity, and I've been running it all day long, and it comes up to 10 at times. Sometimes there are several around. Yes, attacks have increased here in the Kherson city, not just the region as it used to be, and not just in the coastal areas. Currently, there are advances in technology. There are retransmitters that the Russians are installing on Mavic drones. This is a type of commercial drone which allows the FPV drones, which are first-person view drones, follow the drones inland up to 30 kilometers. And this is unprecedented. Before, they were not able to fly as far. And unfortunately, Ukrainian electronic warfare systems can't catch up in this game. It's like a vicious circle because the Russians lower frequencies and the Ukrainians are coming up with new technologies to trace them. And then the Russians fly on the higher frequencies. And it continues on and on and on. So what you hear often in the street, or sometimes as I'm writing an article, I would hear from my window the Kalashnikov rifle shots, or sometimes Hunter rifle shots, because people are trying to shoot down small drones that are basically teeming in the sky. The latest technique is flying in groups, because they not only attacking civilians and cars, civilian cars, which the Russian military channels, Telegram channels, have announced a legitimate target in the city of Kherson. They also do what they call skids, in which they drop explosives. And that could be on people, that could be even on animals, but that also could be incendiary mixture bottles or Coca-Cola cans. So they would drop something heavy on the roof, make a hole, drop another bottle, which will ignite, and then the building will go in flames. Unfortunately, these attacks are very well planned. So sometimes the drones will attack the infrastructure. They, for example, could attack a diesel generator. So the water is not being pumped from the water wells. And say they would attack the power stations. So there's no electricity and there's no water supply. Just a week ago, I've witnessed such an attack. And the firefighters are very late to arrive at the scene, or sometimes they cannot arrive at all because they are also being hunted and they are targeted in what is called a double tack double tap tactic when drones or artillery waiting for first responders and hit them when they arrive to help.
Absolutely frightening. Now, you spoke recently with a young woman who was targeted by one of these drones. Why don't we roll the tape first, and then you can tell us about it.
Я почула звук, що взлетів дрон з будинку. Я голову наліво, от це до мене що тут ранка, повертаю, бачу, що він летить прямо. Я руля вправо, він за мною, і руля вліво, він за мною. І він тако починає, тоді він тако відлітає мене фотографувати, фіксувати на камеру. Тоді він розуміє, що в мене вже справа буде канава, і що мені треба вирулювати руль вліво, і він тако робить цей скид, і він падає прямо, що зачепив моє тіло, граната котилася по мені і взірвалася прямо там, де я крутила педаль. Я згрупувалася як могла, тому я лишилася жива, бо якби я не згрупувалася, я померла б на місці. І граната була наповнена титановою основою, його не можуть лікарі достати. Я не можу стати, тому що уламок залетів мені прямо в кістку, і я буду з ними жити, але пікати на касі в сільпо. У мене такі були думки, я повинна швидше крутити педалі, щоб вижити. Бо я мама двох діток. В мене було 2 скиди. Один скид був на мене в п'ятницю, але я встигла втікти. Я в житті не могла повірити, що я можу настільки швидко пересуватися. А на наступний день він мене все-таки догнав. На транспортах, на яких я їздила, відбувалися скиди. І вони це відео фіксували і викладали все на своїх сайтах. Російські окупанти вбивають наше мирне населення, вони руйнують наше місто. Якщо Росія живе і процвітає, ця війна у нас в Україні ніколи не закінчиться. Вони собі живуть і геть не знають, що таке чути, коли ти чуєш виліт і через 2 секунди прильот. Треба просто наложити їм санкції, позакривати російські кордони, і щоб НАТО закрило наше небо. Помирають мирне населення, а НАТО просто закриває на це очі.
So, Zarina, despite these horrific attacks, it seems that actually the Ukrainian spirit is unbreakable. Tell us more about this young woman and what the civilians are going through under attacks like these.
Yes, Don, as you know, Ukrainians are really resilient and invincible, and you see it every day here reporting from the frontline city of Kherson. For instance, people love to garden here, and despite the sky teeming with drones, you constantly see people, old and young, gardening outside, and they're beautiful gardens. But here comes another danger, because there are remote mining attempts when the Russians drop from the drones disguised anti-infantry band mines called ridiculously petals, and they are disguised so people can't recognize them. They look like stones sometimes, or cans discarded, and there are many injuries, and injuries are especially cruel because this young woman, Anastasia, was injured by what she described as titanium alloy, and I did a lot of research on that because it sounds odd, but in fact Russia is one of the biggest producers of titanium, and they have a lot of scrap, and 1 kilo of titanium scrap in Moscow is only $1.58, so it is not that expensive, and the trick is titanium is very light and it cannot be extracted by magnetic appliances used by the doctors to extract other metals. So Anastasia will unfortunately have to leave with the scrap of titanium, whatever it was, a wire, or sometimes it's a shrapnel, which will be encapsulated inside her bone, as I was explained. But yes, her spirit is up. She was laughing and unbreakable and ready to fight. And here we have another drone approaching, by the way.
Jeez. Well, Zarina, thank you very much for joining us and bringing this important issue to light once again. We really appreciate your work over there in Ukraine and what you're doing. Thank you, Zarina Zabrysky, for joining us here on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you, Don.
This week, the Warsaw Security Forum brought together leaders and experts from across the world to tackle the most urgent defense and security issues facing Europe and Ukraine. The talks focused on addressing the region's evolving threats and the importance of transatlantic cooperation.
One of Europe's key platforms for discussing defense and security challenges, the event brought together 1,500 leaders and experts. The threat posed by Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine were among the leading topics of this year's edition. The participants, including high-ranking government officials, military leaders, and defense experts, explored strategies aimed at bolstering the region's security. Further support for Ukraine against Russian aggression was also discussed. Poland's leadership had a strong presence at the event. Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz and Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski were among those who addressed the attendees.
Dzień dobry, panie prezydencie.
President Andrzej Duda had also spoken to the guests and had highlighted the importance of cooperation between the U.S. and Europe.
More than 1 year ago, we adopted as one of our priorities of our Polish presidency in the first semester of 2025, forging closer ties between the United States and the European Union. According to the slogan, more of the United States in the European Union and more of the European Union in the United States. All these ties, all these bonds, starting with the military ones to the economic, to the political ones, should be systematically made tighter by us.
Guests from abroad included retired U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who warned that NATO lacked key defenses and readiness for a large-scale conventional war, particularly one against Russia. Hodges also emphasized the deficiencies Western armies possess in regard to their air defense systems, military mobility, and ammunition supply. He noted that NATO's eastern flank has just 5% of the air defense capabilities needed to deter potential attacks, which could leave critical infrastructure vulnerable. Other speakers included Georgian President Salome Zurabishvili, who urged support for Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. She had pointed to the upcoming elections in those countries as critical for maintaining political stability in Europe. Belarusian opposition leader Svitlana Tsikhanouskaya emphasized that Ukraine's struggle was not merely a squabble over territory, but a fight for democracy. The entire forum was broadcast by TVP World.
We're at the Warsaw Security Forum for Ukraine this week, and I'm joined by Ambassador Michael Carpenter, Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council. Sir, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, when looking at the recent trip of President Volodymyr Zelensky to the United States and trying to push for his 4-point victory plan, it seems one of the main points to this is for Ukraine to be able to use U.S.-supplied weapons, long-range weapons, strike targets in Russia. Yet he walked away from the United States without such approval. Why exactly is this?
Well, first of all, we surged during President Zelensky's visit to Washington an additional $8 billion in military capability to Ukraine, and we're now in the process of having a discussion about strategic alignment on how we help Ukraine to prevail. That discussion is ongoing. Now, you guys at the media, you focus on the long-range strike permissions into Russia, which frankly is not a game changer on the battlefield. What Ukraine needs right now is to mobilize additional men to man the front lines. It needs training and equipping of its new brigades, and it badly, desperately needs air defense systems. That's why President Biden has decided to host a leaders-level Ukraine defense contact group. It'll be called the Ramstein Summit. It's going to take place on October 12th in Germany, and we're going to issue a challenge to other nations, allies and partners of Ukraine to come to this meeting with concrete pledges of support for Ukraine. Now, I can get into the discussion of why long-range strike permissions are not a game changer, but what we do need to focus on is long-range indigenous production of Ukrainian drones. Because when you look at the cost curve, this is how Ukraine wins this war, by being able to attack C2 nodes, logistics, airfields, but not within the immediate vicinity of the border, which is the ATACMS range, but beyond that. And this is the capability that allows them to do that.
We see some of these, what are purported to be homegrown Ukrainian weapons that are taking out big ammunition dumps that are deeper in Russian territory. How can this not help the Ukrainian war effort?
Precisely, you're making my point for me. This is exactly where Ukraine has a comparative advantage. They are so innovative in being able to look at the battlefield picture, to innovate those drones with software, with other capabilities, and then to deploy them in real time into Russia. And you look at some of these strikes. I mean, the Ukrainians have struck as far north as Toropetsk. It's near the Belarus-Russian border. Some of them even as far as the Arctic Circle. This is exactly where their money needs to go, not into permissions to use ATACMS missiles across the border. We designed a campaign plan with the Ukrainians. We gave them the ATACMS missiles to be able to flush out Russian airfields in Crimea and the occupied Donbass. That's where they should be focusing those capabilities.
So basically, if Ukraine wants to hit any targets beyond the immediate borders with Ukraine, it has to use its own systems.
Well, what we did after we saw this incursion from the north in Kharkiv is we said this is unfair for the Russians to have an advantage where basically they have sanctuary on their side of the border. And that's when President Biden decided within the matter of hours to authorize counterstrike for Ukrainians to be able to strike at Russian positions across the border using American-provided weapons. Now, we did not extend that to ATACMS long-range systems because, as I said, we don't think that's the game changer. Most of the sorties that are being flown against Ukraine are not within ATACMS range. So they need other capabilities. And those capabilities, that's what we should be focused on, is providing them with the financial means to be able to produce this in Ukraine at cost, because you also have to look at the sustainability of the war here. What is sustainable from an economic perspective as well as from a military perspective? And this is where we think that investment into Ukraine's own defense industrial base is where the future of this war lies.
It's been purported also that the Kursk operation was not shared by Ukraine with its partners, including the United States. Did that operation catch some in the government off guard?
Well, we were not given advanced warning of this operation, which so far has been a tactical and an operational success. It's not clear to me whether that gets translated into a strategic success. But, you know, look, Ukraine is prosecuting this war. It's existential for them. They have every right to make decisions on the battlefield as they see circumstances change. My understanding from my conversations with Ukrainian counterparts is that they saw that the lines were thin in the north and they foresaw potentially a Ukrainian attack into the Sumy region. And so they took advantage of what they saw as an opportunity.
President Zelensky has asked Poland and others to potentially use their anti-air defense, if you will, to protect Ukrainian skies. From the United States' vantage point, would this be an escalatory move if, say, Poland was to shoot down rockets that could potentially, rockets, missiles, drones, that could potentially cross into its airspace?
This is crazy magical thinking. Look, yeah? I mean, what if Poland or other allies want to help Ukraine, give fires to Ukraine, give artillery to Ukraine, give an even better air defense system to Ukraine, or give aircraft to Ukraine. But this notion that, I mean, look at the ballistics. It doesn't make any sense. Poland's not going to be able to shoot down incoming threats to Ukraine from Polish territory. We're talking about hypotheticals here that don't make any sense. And the media tends to fixate on some of these things. And it's not to Ukraine's advantage because what they need is capabilities on the front lines. We're all for Poland donating those sorts of capabilities and our other allies. And that's, again, why President Biden has convened this meeting in Ramstein. To meet the Ukrainian needs as they are right now on the battlefield. We encourage all nations to show up with pledges of additional capabilities so that Ukraine can win this war.
The strategy, as long as it takes, it seems to be a very often repeated political term. Is that truly the strategy that the United States and others are employing in this war?
That is not our strategy. Our strategy is for Ukraine to win. We have a classified military strategy that I'm, for obvious reasons, not going to get into here with you. We have a diplomatic strategy, a political strategy. We're working with Ukraine on refining this as conditions evolve.
With the administration in its current final stage, right, because we're going to have a new president one way or the other come January of next year, but the elections are coming up here in November. Maybe I can ask from the standpoint of a continued democratic administration, does anything change as far as strategy is concerned concerning Ukraine?
Well, look, I represent the Biden-Harris administration. I'm not going to talk about contingencies in the future, but I think if we can sustain support, it's critical for Ukraine. And so President Biden has now allocated the remainder of the money from the supplemental bill that was passed in April, so the $61 billion that has now been programmed for Ukraine. Some of this will arrive this year, some will arrive next year. But the critical undertaking for the next administration is going to be to secure additional financial means for Ukraine, obviously in partnership with our allies.
With the Ukrainian forces stretched as thin as they are at this point, you mentioned Ukraine needs to bolster its forces, it needs to train its troops, and it needs to deploy them to the proper places along the front lines. Exactly how can Ukraine do that with such a drain that it's seen in terms of population leaving its country and the heavy death toll that we don't know the full extent of, but that has taken a toll on the Ukrainian population?
You know, it's not an easy question to answer. This is a conundrum that we have to work on with the Ukrainians. We think that NATO has some countries that have conscription-based military systems that could help Ukraine to understand how best and most effectively to conduct mobilization and then to retain those troops inside the armed forces over time. It really is a life cycle issue from when you recruit a new conscript all the way through to Veterans Affairs and benefits and medical services afterwards. We can help Ukraine with this, but it's going to take some time. And in the meanwhile, we really have to focus on the training and equipping piece because this is the vital need right now, is to train those incoming recruits and then to equip the new battalions so that they can be operational in the field.
In terms of Russia's ability to sustain this war, it's spending huge amounts of its budget on military and the war effort. How long can Russia continue to spend as it is currently doing so?
Well, look, whatever prognostications I give you now or that were made earlier in the war were upset the minute that Russia began to receive extensive dual-use items from China, as well as missiles and drones from Iran and North Korea. That has sustained the Russians in this war. But look, the way I see it, we have surged a lot of military assistance to Ukraine, where the Western community of countries has perhaps not done as well is in terms of degrading the Russian defense industrial base. Russia's economy this year is growing at 2.5–3%. And so I think looking at some of those measures to prevent dual-use goods from flowing into Russia, degrading Russia's defense industrial base is equally important as we surge assistance to Ukraine. And there's a lot of work to be done.
Is that the next focal point for the administration as far as maybe putting pressure on some of those countries like China, like Iran?
Well, we've been telling our European allies and partners that, look, you can't have a relationship with the PRC and not understand and not be vocal about the fact that the PRC is not just enabling Russia's war effort against Ukraine. They are creating a long-term security challenge for Europe's security. Because what they're doing is they're providing the propellants, they're providing the machine tools, the optics to create Russian defensive, or I should say capabilities, some of them offensive, that can target European countries in the future. Everybody should be concerned about this, and European leaders should be traveling to Beijing and raising their voices about the concerns they have with this.
Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you for correcting the media's interpretation, at least from your perspective.
Sometimes you guys need a reality check. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that does it from here, from the Warsaw Security Forum. Thank you for joining us, and stay with us for more. Well, that is just one perspective, and an important one because it comes from inside the White House. I appreciate having Ambassador Carpenter on the show to provide his perspective. But relating to his comment that Ukrainian skies can't be protected from Poland, well, I'd like to add a little context. This isn't a wild, fictitious dream made up by myself or by us in the media. So I asked a military man for good measure, the commander of Eurocorps, Lieutenant General Piotr Błazeusz. Here it is. Poland operates AWACS. I imagine they can see a lot of these airborne targets. How feasible is it that Polish forces could, in fact, protect some area of the Ukrainian skies from a pure military standpoint? Bar the political decision.
I'm putting aside all the political decisions, sensitivities, the facts that we, in this case, we might be considered, or the combatants as well, a part of the conflict. Militarily speaking, obviously there will be a lot of air defense threats that we would have to counter. So that would mean that potentially, just as it happened a long time ago over Bosnia when the American F-16 pilot was shot down, those threats will be there, and they will be very, very lively, both missile but also short-range air defense systems. So that's something that we as the military would have to take into account. The electronic warfare, the jamming basically, will be there. So there will be a number of serious threats that we would have to account. From the military, purely military point of view, this is feasible. I mean, the no-flying zones were imposed over different countries, but obviously different circumstances. It was not really an active war with a with the major power. Now, clearly, the military is able to handle such a task, but there is no political will to do so, or at least such a decision has not been made. So I will allow you, the viewer, to draw your own conclusions. Now, for my next interview and a different perspective from that of Ambassador Carpenter, this next discussion is with Donald Trump's former negotiator in Ukraine, Kurt Volker. He was also the ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. And we're at the Warsaw Security Forum, and it's my pleasure to welcome Kurt Volker, United States Special Representative for Ukraine, negotiations from the years 2017 to 2019, right. And of course you were a former U.S. Ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. Sir, thank you very much for joining us on TV.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to get your take. I mean, you were negotiating before there was a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. First of all, did you ever expect that the situation would escalate to what it has escalated to today?
I always knew that that was a risk, because I always understood that Putin wanted to take over Ukraine. He invaded twice before I even started as special representative, taking over Crimea and then launching the invasion in Donbass. So it was always about how could he gain control over Ukraine. So the idea of a full-scale military invasion is always out there. What he was trying to do with the Minsk agreements was create situations that would give Russia levers of control over Ukraine without having to fight a war. And so one of the things I tried to do as soon as I got into my position at that time, 2017, was to say, this is not a frozen conflict. This is a hot war. There are people dying every week, and Russia still has this appetite. So we have to be very clear about what we're trying to do. We have to get Russia to stop and to pull out of Ukraine.
And if you take a look at the current U.S. policy, one of the most repeated phrases that we hear, as long as it takes, we are going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Is this a strategy? And do you think this is what we're doing? I mean, is this what the political leadership has employed?
It's not a strategy. it is, it's not sustainable. It's not something you can actually do for a long period of time. It's not even clear what you're talking about. What's it? Do what as long as it takes? So that phrase has to be scrapped. And we need to speak in clear language about what is going on and what we need to do. From my perspective, we need to make sure that Russian forces are so defeated in Ukraine that Putin decides he has to end the war because it's too costly for Russia to continue. That's what we have to achieve. And then you have to work backwards from there to say, what does it take to get Putin to that frame of mind? And we are nowhere near that frame of mind today. He thinks he can outlast the West. He thinks he can outlast Ukraine. He thinks he's got bodies to spare that he can just waste on the front line. He thinks has an unlimited supply of ammunition from North Korea. He's got no reason to conclude that this is too costly for him. So that's on us. We need to make sure that we are giving Ukraine the weaponry, the ammunition, the permissions, the strategy, and all of the surrounding efforts, like sanctions that actually make sense. We have to do all of that if we want to get Putin into that position. And sadly, that doesn't seem to be the U.S. or the Western goal here. The goal seems to be make sure Ukraine doesn't fail. Don't let them just get destroyed. But don't have a conflict with Russia. Don't escalate. We have to de-escalate. That is a recipe for advantaging Putin.
Do you think there's a fear in Washington that the defeat of Russia would be destabilizing?
Yes, there is. It is a completely misplaced fear, but yes, there is that fear. They worry that a defeat of Russia would lead to possible use of nuclear weapons. They worry that such a defeat would lead to a fragmentation of Russia, which could in turn lead to loose nukes in places where Russia has fissile material that it can't control. We always assess the risk of something happening because of something we might do. We never calculate the risk of what happens if we don't do something. And that is the risk that we actually face. We face Russia trying to destroy Ukraine systematically through daily bombings of cities, civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, trying to, as they call it, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, which really means Russian taking over Ukraine, which then puts Russia right up against the Polish border, right up against other NATO country borders, with a renewed appetite to say that worked. So now we want the Suwałki corridor. We need a land bridge to Kaliningrad. And there are pieces of Estonia, there are pieces of Lithuania that really should be part of Russia. Actually, maybe all the Baltic states should be part of Russia because they were part of the Russian Empire. And you can see how the appetite never stops. So this is a huge risk of not doing things that we're not building into our calculations when we think about the risk of doing something.
A lot of people here in this region are quite concerned, let's put it this way, about the U.S. elections coming up and a potential Trump win. Sir, you used to work for Donald Trump. In your opinion, this is obviously an issue he would have to deal with on day one. He says he can solve the war and end the war in 24 hours. Your best assessment from knowing Donald Trump, what do you think he will do? What do you think he should do?
Okay. First off, just as a framing point for thinking about U.S. elections, if I were European, if I were advising Europeans, my advice would be there's no good outcome, there's no catastrophic outcome. You can work with whatever happens here. And as far as how to handle it, don't make any assumptions about what policy is going to be. You don't know, so don't assume. Do your own homework. What's your interest? What's your capability? What are you prepared to do? And then be proactive, make proposals, suggest how we could work together to deal with this. That is going to be an effective strategy, whether it is Harris or Trump. That's the way I think European leaders should think of this. Now, as far as President Trump goes, I think everything depends on what Putin does. Putin created this war. He sustains this war. He can end this war. It's not on Ukraine. Ukraine can't end the war unless Putin decides he's going to stop fighting. So the question for Trump is, how do you get Putin into a position where he concludes that it's not worth it? It's too costly for Russia to keep this up. We have to do something else. And I know he has a completely different public narrative, puts out all of this disinformation about it's Nazis in Ukraine, Russia's strong, Russia's, this is not even really a war, it's a special military operation. It's all BS. He knows it's BS. The real issue is that he's waging a war and it's not going well, but he still thinks he can win. So how do we convince him that no, he can't, and it's going to start hurting if he continues this? That's the goal. Now, Trump, if he's elected, I'm sure will want to call Putin and will want to say, stop the war. You've got to do this. You're going to destroy Russia. You're going to hurt yourself unless you stop the war. And if you don't, we're going to just give everything that Ukraine needs because we're going to make sure that you don't succeed here. And that's the incentive for Putin to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and stop it. That's what I think he has in mind. I don't know. Nobody knows. Only Trump knows what he would do. But I'm sure any reasonable person looking at the situation knows the only way to end the war is to get Putin to stop it because he's the one who created it. And we are nowhere near that today. We need to put a lot more on the table.
What about the occupied territories? What about the Donbass? What about Crimea?
Yeah. The most important thing for Ukraine is Crimea. It is historically always part of Ukraine. It is vital for Ukraine's security. This is largely where Russia attacks from tonight, drones and missiles and things. It is the threat to Black Sea shipping. So Crimea is very important for Ukraine. Donbass, it's important emotionally for people and psychologically for people. It has largely been leveled, so there isn't much left there. Even the people have left because they were being attacked by Russia, so they had to leave. So it is a little bit less critical. But the issue for Ukrainians will be there is no reason to give up any territory just because of Russia's aggression. Could we live with a border change or an acceptance of some Russian occupation in the future? Only if we have NATO membership, EU membership, guarantees of our security so that Ukraine survives, and then we continue to have a dispute over some occupied territory. And there is, as I said, a difference in mindset between Crimea and Donbass. Crimea is actually critically important for Ukraine.
Foreign Minister Sikorsky has been saying on his tour in Asia, as well as President Stubb of Finland, that President Xi can end this war with one phone call.
No. I don't think anybody can end this war with one phone call other than Vladimir Putin, who calls his top general and says, pull the forces back. Unless he does that, the war continues. Putin has launched this war. It is his desire to do so. China is not in alignment with Russia on this, but it's not China's problem. So China is happy to buy and sell goods with Russia, make money. If Russia is able to weaken the West, great. But China's not invested in this war.
But China enables. Does
they
China
do.
not
Well, they
enable
do.
Russia
They do,
to continue this war?
But they couldn't care. They don't care. If Russia loses, okay, Russia lost. If Russia wins, okay, Russia won. But it doesn't matter to them.
For Donald Trump, could China be a potential piece in the puzzle that could influence whether this war
I would be
continues or not?
surprised because I think China is basically independent. China says, we're China, we have our interests in the region, we have our interests in the global economy, we have our interests with the United States, If we can buy cheap gas from Russia, we will. If Russia needs to buy stuff that we have, we can sell it. If Russia gets destroyed and goes away, okay, that's too bad, the market's gone. But I don't think China's invested in this at all, so I don't think there's leverage to apply.
So at the end of the day, it's Vladimir Putin.
Vladimir Putin, who has himself explained that he wants to restore the Russian Empire, that he sees himself as the equivalent of Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, that Ukraine does not exist as a people, an identity, a nationality, or a country, that Russia has a right to all of this territory, and that Russia has no borders. That's his mindset, that he is an imperialist and a genocidal ruler by definition, by his own definition. That is not going to change unless he is forced to change.
And with that, we will conclude this.
Okay.
Kurt Volker, United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations 2017-2019 and former U.S. Ambassador to NATO under President George W. Bush. Thank you, sir, very much for sharing your thoughts on this very important
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that's all for this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. If you ever missed an episode, you can always find us on YouTube. In fact, the interview with the commander of Eurocorps, Lieutenant General Piotr Błazeusz, is linked in the description and the comments below, so I strongly recommend you check it out. Well, thanks for watching, everybody, and see you soon.